We're driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Just go to Indeed.com/Blue Wire right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
It was really an amazing month. And when you talk about teams getting hot at the right time, there's no question the 2008 Cardinals might be the best example of that ever.
For this week's Remember That Game Rewind, an episode a few years back with Darren Urban of the Arizona Cardinals team website, the 2008 wild card between the Falcons and Cardinals. The first win on an unexpected campaign by Kurt Warner and the Arizona Cardinals. I'm your host, Thomas Emerick. Enjoy the show.
There was a special confluence of events that happened when Kurt Warner really had his last couple of great years here in Arizona. I mean, Kurt Warner was already with the Cardinals starting in 2005 when Denny Green was the coach. And while they threw the ball a lot, once they got both Anquan Boldin and Larry Fitzgerald, part of that was because they never ran the ball very well. And I think it was more out of a necessity and, again, who you had at quarterback. And that's what Kurt wanted to do, was throw the ball. They drafted Matt Leinart in 2006. It looked like Kurt was at the end of the road. He was going to be the backup, and eventually Matt Leinart got hurt in 2007, and Kurt took over the job for good and had his last great stretch with his team. And again, I think it was less about what the organization really wanted and more about what the pieces they had. And when you have a Kurt Warner, a Hall of Fame quarterback, you have Larry Fitzgerald, who's going to be a Hall of Famer, and Anquan Boldin, who some people think might end up in the Hall of Fame someday. That's a pretty good place to start when you want to throw the ball all over the place. And, when Kurt retired, they weren't able to throw the ball nearly as much as they could because they didn't have the guys. And it took Bruce Arians coming in and trading for Carson Palmer to be in a position where they could start throwing the ball a ton again. So this oftentimes is all about who you have at the position. And I just think what Kurt had when he was in Arizona was kind of a once in a lifetime second chance, if you will, with him to kind of build on his reputation. And I do think that those big years that he had with the Cardinals got him into the Hall of Fame. I don't think he gets there without his Arizona years. And obviously the Cardinals were fortunate and thrilled that he had those years here.
Kurt Warner at age 37 makes a big change in his game. From your oral history of Larry's playoff run, I recommend everyone to read Fitz's Fantastic Four. The big sell was getting Kurt to trust, said Todd Haley, that even if Larry was covered, you've got to throw it. That went against the way he was raised and made a name for himself. And you see it from the first play of that game. He gets pressured, throws a fade to Larry. They don't quite connect. How much of a change was that for Kurt Warner in 2008?
I think it was a big change. I mean, it really started in 2007 when Haley first showed up. And I think 2007 when the team went 8-8, and in those days, with the way things had gone with this franchise since moving to Arizona, 8-8 was a big deal. They didn't get to 500 very often. So that was a big step forward. And I think it in part was that Haley had convinced Kurt that he needed to start trusting Fitz even more. I mean, they had already played together in 2005 and 2006. So Kurt had an idea of what it was like to throw to Larry. But I think it just took off from there, among many things. I mean, Larry Fitzgerald also fixed up his game a little bit. But when you start talking about, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves in the Falcons playoff game in particular, there's a 42-yard deep pass for a score to Fitz. That's essentially a jump ball. And when you talk about, you mentioned my oral history of Fitz's great playoff run in 2008, or the 2000, the playoffs that were played in 2009. I think so many of those big plays were representative of what you're talking about, that trust. Basically, Kurt throwing the ball up, which is something he was really loath to do a lot of the time. But he knew that if he put it up there, Fitz was either going to catch it, which he did most of the time, or he was at least going to knock it away. It wasn't going to get picked off. And that was a big deal for Kurt. And I do think it led to a lot of success for that team, especially in that playoff run.
Yeah, 2 big plays for the Cardinals in the first half. The jump ball to Larry Fitzgerald off the flea flicker and the 71-yard drag Bolden takes to the house, both victimizing Lawyer Malloy, who was on that Patriots defense that upset Kurt Warner in his previous playoff game with the Rams. Do you think the kind of emotion Larry shows on that touchdown, and Bolden always shows, had an impact on how the team may have flipped a switch that day after they were struggling down the stretch?
There were so many things that went into that game. I mean, you mentioned flipping the switch. A lot of people remember, or maybe they don't, but Chris Collinsworth ultimately called the Cardinals the worst team that had ever made the playoffs. They got smoked on a road trip in New England, and that was the year Tom Brady was hurt. So Matt Castle was the quarterback, and in week 16, they went up there in the next to last game of the year. They played in the snow. They didn't want to be there. It was clear all weekend the players' heads weren't in that game. They had long since clinched the division because the rest of the division was so bad. And they got lost 47-7 in New England. And what ended up happening was, it was Christmas week the following week. It was the horrible weather was even in Arizona. It was nasty rain. Ken Wisenhunt made them practice in the rain really hard and kind of was like, you guys better figure this out before you get to the postseason. They did get to win that finale, but there was still a lot of questions going into that first playoff game against the Falcons, who had a better record than the Cardinals, but the Cardinals got to host because they were the division winner and the Falcons were a wild card. So I think they needed some of that emotion. The Fitz thing helped. The Anquan Bolden play, that becomes a much bigger deal, less about because of emotion and a lot more because Anquan hurt his hamstring on the play. I don't know I know he came out after that, and I'm not so sure he came back in the rest of the day. I'm pretty sure it was done because he pulled it on the long catch and run, and then he ended up missing the next week against Carolina. So that was a pretty impactful play, not for the emotion, but because they lost Anquan Bolden. And I do think there was some emotion needed, but honestly, I think the emotion that they truly got was less about that play and more about early in the second half when Antrell Roll ended up recovering the fumble and returning it for a touchdown to give them the lead.
Right. Yeah, you go into halftime down 3 after leading 14-3 most of the half. Matt Ryan storms back, Offensive Rookie of the Year. Pro Football Focus had him graded as their number 2 quarterback in the regular season. And so he doesn't get down, roars back. There was an interesting note they had in the broadcast about how Kurt Warner, what he liked most about Matt Ryan was that when he makes a mistake, he bounces back. And in that half, Matt Ryan throws a pick on the first possession, comes right back. Did you notice a particular affection Warner had for Matt Ryan or any similarities he saw in his game?
Not really. I mean, I think Kurt appreciated any good quarterback play, and that was Matt Ryan's rookie year, if I recall correctly. Yep. So, I mean, I think there was great appreciation for a guy being able to come in as a rookie and lead the Falcons to whatever it was, 10 or 11 wins, whatever they had. So I think there was that appreciation. But I do think, as you mentioned, Matt Ryan, that was people want to talk about the loudest buildings or loudest stadiums in the NFL. And I've been to all of them, and there are some really loud ones. I go to Seattle every year. That is incredibly loud. There's a couple other places I've been that deserve the reputations they have for being loud. But I'll tell you right now, when the Cardinals were making that playoff run in 2008 especially, and those home games, the Falcons game, late in the Falcons game, and then also in the NFC Championship, you're not going to find with the roof closed a much louder place. And I do think that Matt Ryan got a little rattled a few times in that game because of the crowd, because of the circumstances. I mean, I think he played a solid game, but the safety in particular, I thought the crowd was going nuts. And so I think ultimately, while I think Kurt, appreciated what Matt Ryan could bring to the table, I do think the Cardinals benefited by the fact that Matt Ryan didn't have a ton of experience.
Perhaps a chip on the shoulder. They're coming in. Ken Wisenhunt noting that a lot of people said we were the worst playoff team ever to get in. He's just openly saying that day. To put in perspective how much out of nowhere this NFC title run, the Cardinals went into the playoffs. Vegas gave them 20-1 odds to win the NFC going into the playoffs. For reference, the 2011 Giants were 12-1, and the 2012 Ravens were like 10-1. So the Cardinals at 20-1 over the past 15 years, no one was anywhere close to that as far as low Vegas odds to make it through. This game, they turned it around. Only 2.5-point favorites at home against the Falcons, not even getting the field goal. So did you notice like a chip on the shoulder, not necessarily related to Vegas, but obviously stuff in the media, some of what you referenced?
Yeah, there's no question about that. There was a giant chip on their shoulder. It was an odd team in a lot of ways. I mean, the Cardinals weren't a super young team per se, but they had a lot of inexperience. I mean, these guys had never been to the playoffs that had been on this team, the heart of this team. Fitz had never been to the playoffs. Anquan Bolden, Darnell Dockett, Antrell Roll, Carlos Dansby. None of these guys had been to the playoffs because they had been Cardinals trying to build up this team in a lot of ways since Denny Green had been around, and Ken Wisenhunt kind of took it to the next level. So there was absolutely a chip on their shoulder. I think there was a lot of questions. I mean, the team, it took a while, even though it was their first playoff game in a decade, the Falcons game. It took them the majority of the week to get sold out, that it would even be, in those days, you'd sell the blackout. So to even get telecast locally. So I think there were some fans that weren't real sure after the really great start, and then they just limped to the finish. They lost 5 of the last 7. So, I mean, I think ultimately that was part of it. But again, they got off to a slow start in this one, and then it just kind of got on a roll. The next week they went to Carolina. They had played in Carolina during the season and lost, but it was a game they could have won, and I think they knew that. And that was the day Jake Delhomme just melted down, had all his turnovers. And then, of course, they had the miracle result. There was only one way they could have hosted the NFC Championship going into the playoffs, and that was if the 6th seed Philadelphia made it all the way through. And somehow the Eagles won their wild card game and then went to New York to play the number 1 Giants and won in New York. And that was another team, the Eagles, that the Cardinals had played during the regular season. They went to Philly. They got hammered on Thanksgiving night. But it was just like the New England game. It was almost like the Cardinals mentally weren't there before it even started. I could kind of tell it on the road trip. And so when you got to the NFC Championship, I felt like they're at home. I think they're going to win this game, even though they lost by 20. And a lot of people weren't sure that was going to happen, but it was kind of the role that they were on at the time. It was really an amazing month. And when you talk about teams getting hot at the right time, there's no question the 2008 Cardinals might be the best example of that ever.
And Kurt Warner didn't even enter that previous offseason as the starter. It was Matt Leinart. Heading into camp, did it seem 50-50 Kurt would come out or that Leinart would retain the starting job? And how did that change Warner in any way?
First of all, I'll take the last part first. No, it didn't change anything Kurt ever did. And, Kurt Warner is a great man. He's a Hall of Famer. But there is no question that there is no bigger believer in Kurt Warner than Kurt Warner. And he always felt like he was the better quarterback. It was just a question. And he felt that way when he was at the end with the Rams, when he was with Mark Bulger. He felt that way even after Eli Manning was drafted with the Giants. And he felt that way when he showed up in Arizona, that if coaches gave him a fair competition, whoever it was against, he would be better. Now, he knew the politics of the NFL, that wouldn't always change. I mean, he had been beat up in the Rams. They wanted to move on. Okay. He got signed by the Giants. As soon as they drafted Eli Manning or traded for Eli Manning, he knew his time was going to be short there. And when he came to Arizona, he had been there a couple of years, or the 1 year, and then they drafted Matt Leinart. And he knew the point was that Matt Leinart was supposed to be the quarterback. So he wasn't unaware, but he went into 2007. He was the backup in Ken Wisenhunt's first year, but there was no question that Matt Leinart was never Ken Wisenhunt's choice as a quarterback. Although Leinart started very early in the season, they started using Kurt Warner as kind of like a relief pitcher in hurry up and fast-paced 2-minute situations, which he excelled at. And there was this weird shuffling of the quarterbacks those first 5 weeks until Leinart got hurt. And so you ended the season in 2007 with Kurt Warner having a good year, the team playing better as the year went on. But because Leinart had been hurt, he went into the offseason of 08 thinking, okay, Whisenhunt was one of those, I don't want a guy losing his job because he was hurt. So Leinart technically was the starter, but I think there was a real feeling all along that Kurt Warner was going to end up as the starter, and it was only a matter of time. And they did take it all the way into training camp, but eventually when Kurt was named the starter, it really wasn't that big of a surprise. Kurt Warner was just too good at that point. He fit too well in that offense, and they were better with him on the field.
We're driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Just go to Indeed.com/Blue Wire right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
And they end up leaning on Kurt Warner a ton, top pass ratio in the league. At age 37, he leads the league in combined hits and sacks, along with lapping the field pretty much in passing yards under pressure. Hit while thrown 17 times. No other quarterback that season was in double digits. Then in the playoff game, they get to Warner. First and second down, hit him. On third down, he's pressured for a dump off. They punt that first drive. They come back the next drive. 3 straight runs with Edgerrin James. How did Edgerrin James' fairly public disagreement with the direction of the offense impact the locker room, and did it impact anything that day?
I think Edgerrin handled himself all that season like a pro. The way that year went, Edgerrin was the starter. They had drafted Tim Hightower in the 5th round, I believe. He was the backup running back. Edgerrin was not the player he once was. They did not have a great offensive line, and they were better throwing the ball. And about midway through the season, Whisenhunt benched Edgerrin, and Edge was not happy, as you can well imagine, and he barely played. I think he might not have played at all for 3 games, and Hightower got the majority of the work. And in hindsight, it did turn out that giving Edge a little bit of that rest might have helped, but it clearly rubbed him the wrong way. You could kind of tell that this was going to be the final year of Edgerrin James in Arizona. But I will say that going into the playoffs, they knew who their top running back needed to be. And I thought Edgerrin had a nice game in his limited work because they didn't run the ball a ton against Atlanta. And if you look at that playoff run, no one's going to confuse them with the Ravens in terms of how they ran the ball. But Edgerrin had a very nice postseason all the way through the Super Bowl. And I believe that for all the other things that happened for the Cardinals, and as great as Larry Fitzgerald was, which he was, I believe that the Cardinals do not make the Super Bowl that year without the running ability of Edgerrin James, who gave them, while not a great running game, a better than average running game for when they needed it so that they could keep going to the pass. And I do think that made a difference. I think being able to turn to Edge once you got to the playoffs made a difference. And Edgerrin was enough of a veteran of playoff games that he was one of the few guys that could tell guys what's up and what's happening. And he gave them that swag that I think they needed too.
Come out at halftime, down 3. On the other side, the Cardinals are doing a great job stopping the run. Michael Turner, the NFL's the leader in carries that season, barely scraped over 2 yards a carry that day. How surprising was it that the Cardinals' run defense came out so strong that day? And coming out of halftime, what was the mood about how to stem the bleeding that after the Falcons had scored 2 touchdowns end of the half?
I think overall the Cardinals defense played above its head, maybe to where it would need it to be in that playoff stretch. I mean, if you think now they tended to break down a couple times as we saw in a couple playoff games, but the Falcons game, they were pretty good in the second half, but they came out solid, like you said, up until the end of the second quarter. The Carolina, we already mentioned that with all the turnovers they forced. They gave up an easy opening drive for a touchdown, and after that, the Panthers couldn't do anything. And the Cardinals built a giant lead against Philadelphia in the NFC Championship because the Eagles couldn't do anything. So I think defensively, the Cardinals played excellent in the postseason. And again, when you talk about getting the crowd back into it and where it was in that game against the Falcons, it wasn't necessarily the offense that did it. It was the forced fumble and the Antrell Roll returning it for a touchdown to give them the lead and to kind of reinvigorate everybody that, okay, this could still happen. Because again, when you're talking about the Falcons playoff game in particular, I think everybody was thrilled they were in the playoffs, but there wasn't a whole lot of belief that this was a team that was going to go very far. And so I think that permeated into the fan base. And while they were certainly willing to cheer, any ups and downs tended to be looked at a little bit more pessimistically, I think. So I think that fumble return was a big deal. And then if you're talking defense, they also got a safety later in the half that, again, crowd was going crazy. You swarm Matt Ryan, you get 2 points out of it. In a game that was close, that was pretty important.
Darnell Dockett jumps the snap count beginning of the second half when Falcons start with the ball, completely swings the momentum. Do you think that crowd volume probably had something to do with Dockett being able to jump that snap count and force the fumble on the handoff?
It's funny, there was always this talk about whether Darnell Dockett was actually offsides on that play and everything. There was some talk later that maybe the Falcons had given away a tell on their snap count and stuff, which allowed him to get off so quickly. So, I think the crowd played into it. I think there's a possibility maybe the Cardinals did figure out something with a rookie quarterback snap count. But clearly, when you're talking about playoffs and close playoff games, turnovers matter, defensive touchdowns matter. And when you're talking about doing it at home, when you can get the crowd behind it, that's just giant.
Soon after, the Cardinals are up 28-17, and you have these Cardinals defensive backs. Dominic Rodgers-Cromartie on Roddy White a ton. Roddy White, 16 targets, 11 catches, but held to only about 80 yards. And then you have Adrian Wilson, Antrell Roll, and some good coverage linebackers in Gerald Hayes and Carlos Dansby there. Did it seem like the Cardinals just weren't really worried about anyone else besides Roddy White that day?
Obviously Turner was a very good running back. So I would say, there was that. And if you're talking about the passing game, I think the Cardinals, quite frankly, were all about, hey, we're going to try and pressure this rookie quarterback. We're going to try and put him in bad positions. And we're going to try and build the lead. Again, as good as the defense was playing, this was a team that was still built on offense first. And you hope that you could, outscore teams. And so once you got that lead and they were able to bring pressure and, maybe force Matt Ryan into a bad throw, getting picked off, that was the point of the defense that day. It wasn't necessarily that they weren't worried about any particular guy, but it was about getting that lead and then getting the pressure on the rookie quarterback.
Yeah, and coming out of the half, assuming Bolden's probably not coming back, does that change the Cardinals' approach, or is it more so them having the lead that makes them a little more run heavy than they'd been during the regular season?
I think it was a combination of both. Ken Wisenhunt at his heart was a guy. He would come from Pittsburgh in the days when Jerome Bettis was. And he was the offensive coordinator in the days when Jerome Bettis was like the main guy before they started throwing the ball all over the place. And I think in his heart of hearts, he'd rather do it that way. And really, they got they're up in the third quarter, with the lead after the fumble, and there's a drive that they take almost 8 minutes off the clock on, that gets them a touchdown, and they run the ball, I want to say 9 times out of 14 plays or something like that. And I think that's the kind of offense that ultimately Ken Whisenhunt enjoyed doing. I mean, it's grinding clock. You're doing it with a lead. You end up pushing it into the end zone. There weren't a whole lot of big plays on that drive. I think there was only one play of more than 10 yards. And that's like fantastic old school football that I think that they wanted to do at that time. Plus, again, it gave them the lead. And then they got an interception right after. I mean, the momentum had clearly shifted. And again, I think with Ken Whisenhunt, he's like, if we can run clock and hold on to the ball while running it, with the crowd behind us, that's the ideal way to play, even if we do have Kurt Warner and Larry Fitzgerald and Anquan Bolden.
Gandy allowing 0 sacks to John Abraham. No one gets home for the Falcons that day. How crucial was that in their confidence in having Warner come out and throw at the end of the game when they know they need to get first downs to close it out?
I think offensive coordinator Todd Haley was like that whole year was super aware of where their offensive line was. They did not have a great offensive line. They had Mike Yandy at left tackle, Reggie Wells at left guard, center was Lyle Senline, the right guard was Deuce Latui, the right tackle was Levi Brown. It was not a great offensive line, but they were not a bad offensive line. And the one thing that they had was this whole stretch, all 20 games, 16 regular season and the 4 postseason games, they all started, every single one of them. And that's rare for an offensive line, obviously, and I think that helped them. But I think they came to play in the postseason. Just like most of this team, I feel like this offensive line played better when it counted than it might have down the stretch. And you don't want to have to wait for a team to turn it on, but they were able to do that. And I do know that, even going all the way to the Super Bowl, one of the reasons they were able to storm back from that deficit in the Super Bowl was because because they had to. Kurt Warner convinced Haley to open things up, go to more 4 wide receivers. And one of the reasons Haley didn't want to was because he didn't want this offensive line having to protect against the ferocious Pittsburgh pass rush. And they didn't have a choice, and they were better offensively that way. So I think most of the year, and that includes the Atlanta game, going back to that drive I was talking about where you're doing the run, they did enough of that stuff and using Edgerrin James especially to keep pass rushers off balance a little bit. And Kurt Warner, you can't discount what Kurt Warner brought to the table. Kurt Warner knew where guys were coming from. He was willing to take a hit, as you mentioned in the stats earlier. He was willing to take a hit to make the throw, but he's also smart enough to know that I can't get hit every play, and I got to get the ball out to the right people.
On that final drive, Falcons had brought the score to 30-24. They have a few minutes left, come out first down, hit Fitzgerald downfield, and then eventually get a 3rd and 16 with a chance to basically close it out. Warner drops it over the linebacker to a virtual unknown tight end, put the Cardinals basically into the next round. Remember if that was the initial read there?
So,
Bolden out of the game?
I would doubt that Steven Spock was the initial read out of that. I mean, they put themselves in a position where they could wrap it up, even though they were up 6. They had the ball. You mentioned the first pass to Fitz to get the first down. And they got a second first down because of another nice pass to Steve Breston that got him 25 yards. But you're still in front of the 2-minute warning. You're able to use up, or Atlanta's used up all their timeouts. And they use up their second timeout on a first down run that's 2 yards. And then on second down, for whatever reason, they try to run a reverse with Steve Breston. And John Abraham blows it up, and it goes nowhere, and they lose 8 yards on 2nd and 8. So all of a sudden, and Atlanta takes their last timeout. So you're still in front of the 2-minute warning, and it's 3rd and 16. And it's, you're figuring that you're going to have to give the ball back to Atlanta with 2 minutes to go, and a touchdown beats you. And that's where the greatness of Kurt Warner comes in. Like I said, I do not believe Steven Spock was the first read on that play. I'm sure Fitz was the first read on that play because you'd be crazy not to be looking for him. But Steven Spock found a hole in the zone deep enough, and Keith Brooking, the linebacker, the veteran linebacker, just had moved up too much. And Kurt Warner, I mean, there's a reason he's a Hall of Fame quarterback, and he drops the perfect pass into Steven Spock to gain 23 yards. He goes down, and they're able to kneel out the clock. And it was such a great ending, because not only did they get the playoff win, but it's on the arm of Kurt Warner, and he does it. And it's a nice highlight for Steven Spock, who was a great guy, and who early in the next playoff game ends up blowing out his knee and misses the rest of the Super Bowl run. But he did have his moment where he made the big catch.
Yeah, calling Spock's number there, would be surprising, even though no slouches in the Falcons secondary at cornerback with Chavis Jackson, Dominique Foxworth, Chris Houston, Brent Grimes at that time playing sparingly, but like a good deep unit. And there they close it out. Last question, was there a different vibe coming off this team walking out of the stadium that day?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, they got a playoff win. They believed in themselves. The true momentum for the playoff run probably didn't get going until the Carolina game the next week. But they had a lot of confidence going into the Carolina game. Like I mentioned earlier, they had gone there earlier in the year, and they had nearly won, and they felt they should have won. So there wasn't a whole lot of fear that they were playing this 12-4 Carolina team. It got a little dicey, like I said, at the beginning of the Carolina game, where they gave up like a touchdown drive in like 5 plays, and it was super easy for Carolina. And it looked like, okay, this might be the end of the run. But the rest of the game, the Cardinals dominated. Larry Fitzgerald in particular dominated, and they were off. And again, this was a team of young, good players that I think they just needed some confidence. The Falcons game gave them that. And then having Kurt Warner in their ears, their collective ears every week, telling them what it took to get all the way to the Super Bowl, knowing that he had been there twice already, I think helped too.
This has been another episode of Remember That Game. Please rate, review, subscribe, and check out more episodes.